The Miracle's actions in Blasphemous 2 are a direct result of the conclusion of the Wounds of the Eventide DLC from the first game, an event which resulted in the Penitent One and Crisanta slaughtering the cosmic entities known as the High Wells. Without their direction, the Miracle retreated for an age, and only returned when answering the sincere prayer of a couple who desired a child. Yet the chain of events that led to the Penitent One killing the High Wells is somewhat convoluted, but understanding it is key in understanding the setup for Blasphemous 2. At the core of Blasphemous 1's lore is the figure known as the Twisted One, or the Father, and throughout this video I will show how I believe the Father was one of the guiding figures behind the murder of the High Wells, and guiding the Penitent One to this ultimate goal. At first glance, the importance of this figure is diminished in Blasphemous 2, yet we still see him as the central and largest character in the Canvas of Light and Time ending of the second game as well. While the influence of the Twisted One has faded in Custodia in the era of Blasphemous 2, I believe he is still important to the Penitent One's journey. In this lore video I have two main objectives. Firstly, I will explain the Wounds of the Eventide storyline and what happened, as well as the Father's importance to the killing of the High Wells. Secondly, I hope to bridge the gap between the two games and why the events of the first game's final DLC led to the Miracle creating the Miracle Child in Blasphemous 2. So join me this week as we explore the lore of Blasphemous 1 and 2, and if you like lore videos then consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Just a reminder guys, that if you're interested in trying out Gamersupps, then feel free to use my link below or code SmoughTown at checkout for 10% off all products. Grab yourself some sus flavours or a waifu cup with 10% off. And now back to the lore. Before we get into the High Wells and the Twisted One, I think we should do some groundwork when it comes to the basics of the Miracle and the way in which it interacts with the world of Custodia. In Blasphemous 2, the Witness, who by the way is the Winged Child, tells us that many eons have passed since the Miracle first abandoned the people, as he says,
"Never will I comprehend for what exalted reasons I was chosen to witness and narrate the events by which the Miracle sought to return to us. For many eons have passed since it abandoned us."
So he's talking about the gap of time since the end of Blasphemous 1 and its return in Blasphemous 2. So of course this means that the events of Blasphemous 1 were a very long time ago, to the point that the land we're in, which is still Custodia, has changed dramatically. Obviously the fact that this is still Custodia from the first game is confirmed when we find the Mother of Mothers Church buried deep within the landscape of the current Custodia. It's also a fact confirmed by the devs in episode 10 of their Dev Diaries, which I will link below. But the fact it's so unrecognisable from the Custodia of the first game just reinforces the idea that a long time, a millennia or more, has passed since the events of the first game. However, while they are both separated by a long period of time, both games depict a period in which the Miracle is active and its corruption has spread throughout the land, resulting in the monstrosities we fight as basic enemies and bosses. In Blasphemous 2, we are outright told that the Miracle contagion spread from the Winged Child that was born from the pious couple, and the Miracle's intervention. The enemies of Blasphemous 1 are also the result of a Miracle outbreak, so to speak, and we get a lot of the backstory from both the Kickstarter page for the first game and some in-game lore. The Kickstarter page shows us some concept art and tells us the background to the events that led to this first outbreak in Blasphemous 1. It started when the High Pontiff of the Miracle religion, Escribar, got tired and frustrated with the lack of devotion from the people, and so he turned his golden throne so his back was facing the people in a symbolic gesture. In time the Miracle manifested through him, and he grew into a great withered tree that burst through the top of the cathedral, and then burned for 90 days and 90 nights. There was then a pile of ash left with his throne at the top. We learn what happens after via an in-game text known as the Works and Grace of the Sorrowful Miracle, presumably a religious text from this era of miracle worship, and it's found in item descriptions from the first game. And I will now read the second verse of this Works found in the item description of the Heart of Virtuous Pain. It reads the following: "The wind blew strongly through the fractures of the cathedral that the great tree had originated, lifting the ash, creating dense grey clouds, hiding the whole mother church, and drowning her in a deep darkness of lead. The ground began to tremble. Then a terrible cry was heard from the depths of the mountain of ash. And that cry was joined by more and more guttural screams, animal roars, monsters, and one which was heard above all, the scream of an old man, which resounded gravely, as out the throat of a giant." So those touched by ash were transformed into the enemies you face in the first game. The mountain of ash you find at the end of the game is the source of the miracle contagion in the first game and the spread of these twisted abnormalities, beings that have been touched by the miracle. And of course the cry of the old man described here is Escribar, who has taken a giant form by the end of the game. The Zealous saw these monsters as holy works of the miracle, and this is something that Crisanta accuses us of at the beginning of her fight, that we have slaughtered the holy works of the miracle. The beginning of the first game tells us that the miracle manifests what is in our soul, mourning, repentance, and pain within us. It is then manifested in a physical form by the miracle's power, often manifesting in a warped and cruel way, as you see from the enemy types and bosses throughout the game. Then, in like the case of Escribar in the first game and the Witness Child in the second game, the miracle's corruption can spread like a contagion. And in that way you begin to understand the way in which the miracle interacts with the land of Custodia. But of course the miracles bestowed upon Escribar and later the Witness are far from the first time the miracle interacts with the inhabitants of Custodia. No, that dubious honour goes to a character known as the Father, and the first miracle. And this must have taken place even long before Blasphemous One and Escribar's miracle. Indeed, Laudes, a companion of the Father, describes her imprisonment as a millennia, meaning that the events of the Twisted One must have happened a millennia even before Blasphemous One. Thus we can see how far into the past the Twisted One existed, and how long ago the miracle first interacted with the land of Custodia. And his twisting is the foundational event of the miracle, which starts the miracle faith within Custodia. Hence it takes the name of the first miracle. And especially in Blasphemous 1, this event is one of the most important underlying pieces of lore, which is why it's so impactful when we come to the ruins of the Mother of Mothers Church in Blasphemous 2, one of my favourite moments in playing the second game. It is a reminder of that long lost era, and how much time has actually passed. For those who didn't play the first game, the Mother of Mothers Church was the central cathedral to the religion in Blasphemous 1's era, the central location to that institution, and one of the final locations in the game where we would eventually confront Escribar, essentially the Pope of this era and the main antagonist to the game. At the heart of the Mother of Mothers interior was found the Tree of the Three Words, the location where the first miracle took place. It is where the Father, the Twisted One, died. This young man is the first saint of the miracle religion. It was in him that the miracle first revealed itself, as he sat on a log and then prayed for pain, for punishment, to ease the guilt found within his soul. According to Deogracias, he actually prayed to the high wills for punishment, but it was this grievous miracle that answered, and first revealed itself to the world of Custodia. The miracle answered his prayer for punishment. From the log that he sat on grew roots that wrapped around his body and broke his body around them, essentially twisting his broken body around a tree. And you can see the exact form that this punishment took by the iconography of him, or in the memories of Laudes, one of his companions. His twisted form takes on a similar role to the cross and Jesus within Christianity, so a massively important figure to say the least. And when he finally died, a tree grew in that spot, a tree that would spew gold as a reminder of that first miracle. The architecture in this room is different from the rest of the cathedral, and thus I always assumed that this is the oldest part of the church, that was initially built around the tree itself, a holy site, again reinforcing the importance that the Father and this spot held to those who worship the miracle. The husk of this tree is still present in the current era of Blasphemous 2, found in the depths of the Mother of Mothers Church. But the fact that this location is so forgotten and abandoned is the most telling sign of how much time has passed, for in days past in the time of Blasphemous 1, never would this artifact have been left to rot, abandoned. Yet here it is, buried under the streets of a new civilization above, gathering cobwebs and dying. If we linger here, we can hear the echoes of the past. These are of course the echoes of Deogracias' speech to the Penitent One that he gave in Blasphemous 1, where he described that first miracle that led to the Father's canonization as a saint.
One devout and tormented youngster asked the High Will for punishment. He placed a wooden log where he sat and prayed. He prayed hoping to be heard. He prayed for pain, so he could ease the guilt that sharply pierced his soul. Then the miracle manifested itself. It made roots grow and twist over his arms and legs, but not a cry nor a complaint came out from his mouth. Every inhabitant of this land bore witness to it, and all of them prayed before the besought eternal joy of that youngster. This triune tree that sprouted years after his death was named the Knot of the Three Words.
The Father is like to the miracle that Jesus is to God, a more humanoid figure through which a higher power is worshipped. As such, both of the game's symbology is mainly based around the Twisted One. The figure of 8 symbol, for example, is the symbol of the Twisted One, and we see it everywhere in both games. And again, this symbol is analogous to the cross of Christianity. There are many other saints and martyrs of the miracle religion, yet the Father stood above all the others for so long because he is symbolic of what a true penitent should be, and he was the first. It was in him that the miracle first made its presence known in the lands of Custodia. He's the founding figure, and this is why in this era that he was twisted by the miracle, he was paraded around by laudes and hermanicidas before he passed away. He was a living religious relic. Yet in the time of Blasphemous 2, despite his symbol still being used as a religious icon, the Father seems to have been more or less forgotten. Instead, the Witness, the winged child, seems to have taken a similar role of the central saint, alongside his mother and father. But this of course makes a lot of logical sense. After all, this is a completely new era, after so long has passed that many will have forgotten the miracle. And it was through this family, the mother, the father, and the son, that the miracle once again announced its presence to the world of Custodia. Yet the Penitent One returns to this new era, and he is also a relic of an older age. And clearly the Penitent One has not forgotten the Father, as when he dies and he drops guilt, we still see this guilt taking the form of the Father's symbol. And there is good reason for this, because the Penitent One is inexorably tied to the Father. The Penitent One belonged to a religious sect called the Brotherhood of the Silent Sorrow, a brotherhood whose penance was silence, a fact stated by Deogracias at the beginning of the first game.
I am Deogracias, witness to and narrator of the acts of the grievous miracle. Such is my penance, as yours is silence.
What is interesting is that the Penitent One sect seems to be based around worship of the Father in particular, not the miracle. Indeed, the biggest statue of the Father we see in any game is seen in their monastery. One of the interesting things said by Deogracias is his description of how the Father took his punishment, that he didn't utter a cry or a complaint, he was silent in his punishment.
It made roots grow and twist over his arms and legs, but not a cry nor a complaint came out from his mouth.
I think this tells us of the morals of the Silent Brotherhood. These are penitents that emulate his silent sorrow. Taking his punishment without complaint is clearly seen as a dignified and pious act worthy of tribute. the fact the Brotherhood venerated the father and his silence is reinforced by the key to the chamber of the eldest brother, which reads the following: "I hear his lament, the one who was believed mute from the beginning, since there were witnesses to the first miracle, the afflicted one who asked for punishment, and had it granted to him." Thus the Penitent One's entire makeup is thanks to the Father. He is an adherent specifically of the Twisted One. Therefore, for me, it isn't surprising that he ends up being an instrument of the Father, but that is something we will get into shortly. The Penitent One is essentially immortal in that he always rises from the dead, being dropped off by the cherubs, brothers of the miracle, at a prie-dieu upon his death. The Kneeling comic, the prequel comic to the first game, has a number of dialogues that imply the Penitent One has been chosen by the miracle, and it is that force that allows him to come back to life after death. This is specifically implied by Crisanta, who actually kills the Penitent One in the Kneeling comic, which is why he is dead at the beginning of the first game. She says that if the miracle has truly chosen him, he will rise from the dead, and he does. This is clearly because the miracle has a plan for the Penitent One, and that plan is clearly what comes to fruition in ending A in Blasphemous 1, which was the good ending before Wounds of the Eventide came along. In this ending, the Penitent One takes on the world's guilt and ends the current era of penance by sacrificing himself, after successfully claiming the Pile of Ash. This ending is what the miracle hoped for, because it would bring an end to the current age of penance and suffering, which had essentially ran its course, and start a new age of penance with a new central figure. But this of course necessitates the Penitent One killing Escribar and ending the current rule, and I therefore theorise, as I did back in a 2019 video, that this is the reason that Crisanta is sent to kill the Penitent One. Crisanta of course serves Escribar and the Mother of Mother's Church, and it would make sense that she is sent to kill not only the Penitent One, but the entire Brotherhood of the Silent Sorrow. Escribar had seen the Penitent One in his dreams, but he didn't know anything of him, except for his cold, nameless visage.
In my dreams I heard your footsteps coming closer. In my dreams I tried to talk to you and introduce myself, but nothing I know of you, apart from your cold, nameless visage, apart from your calloused and wounded hands, apart from the mourning of your deaths.
Meaning that he likely foresaw that one member of the Brotherhood of the Silent Sorrow would be the one to end him, and it makes sense that he would therefore send Crisanta to kill all of them, just to make sure. Given they all wore the same helmets, it could have been any of them. This is of course just my interpretation of the events of the first game, but it makes it clear that the miracle had a sort of plan, and that the Penitent One was part of that plan, and it deliberately set him against Escribar and the current institution. This is the same in Blasphemous 2 with ending B, the bad ending, in which we have killed our way through all of the sentinels of the miracle, again seeming to be acting against it, only to later learn that it is part of its plan when it fuses us with the newly born miracle child. This was the miracle's desire, to lead us here to this point so we could be tricked into fusing with the miracle child, becoming the perfect icon for the second age of the miracle, guilt and miracle combined, the second Psalm. However, what is not part of the miracle's plan is the good ending in Blasphemous 2, which we will look at the end of this video, and also the ending of the Wounds of the Eventide DLC, the events of which shook the miracle to its core to the point where it retreated for eons. And it's those events that we'll look at now. I want to preface this discussion on the nature of the endings of Blasphemous 1. Clearly the Wounds of the Eventide ending is the true ending, as it leads directly into the events of Blasphemous 2, where the High Wills have been killed, the miracle has retreated, and the Penitent One had been laid to rest. However, I have heard the argument that ending A from the first game, the sacrifice ending, also must have happened, as it would explain the wooden arm that the Penitent One has in Blasphemous 2. The adherents of this theory see his wooden arm as a relic of an alternate timeline or ending, given the fact the Penitent One does turn to wood in this ending from the first game. I disagree on this, though I admit it is still a possibility. However, I instead see his wooden hand as the result of the Custodia of Sin, and this was the thorn that Deogracias gives the Penitent One at the beginning of the first game.
Take this thorn and place it on the handle of your sword. If, when the time comes, as you grip your weapon firmly, you notice that it wounds you and makes you bleed, having grown with more thorns sprouting from it, writhing over the figure of the Father carved into the knob, that will mean that you are at the mercy of the grievous miracle, whether for its punishment or its forgiveness.
In order to achieve the Wounds of the Eventide DLC ending, you still need to go through all of the Confessor gauntlets. From a lore perspective, these Confessor statues are the beings that take on the guilt from those in Custodia acting as Confessors. By breaking into them and defeating these challenges, we seem to absorb the guilt of those from Custodia. And by breaking into all of these statues of the Confessors, we absorb all of the guilt of the lands of Custodia. And this allows us to climb up the pile of ash because we have taken on the mantle of guilt. However, this also grows the thorn that Deogracias gives us. It had been put into the pommel of the Penitent One's sword, and as the guilt within us grows, so too does this thorn, wrapping around the Penitent One's arm. And so for me, his wooden arm in the second game is simply a leftover from this Custodia of Sin that grew and wrapped around the Penitent One's arm, and is not a remainder of an alternate past or alternate ending that must also have happened. And the only true ending is the Wounds of the Eventide DLC, but let me know your thoughts below. Anyway, the Wounds of the Eventide story begins with the Penitent One meeting Perpetua, the sister of Esdras and member of the Red Anointed Legion, the legion that serves the Mother of Mothers Church. Near Hondo, the Penitent One faces a manifestation of Perpetua, and then later comes across her tomb. Here Perpetua speaks to the Penitent One and explains the way of things and why there was a version of her that attacked him at Hondo.
Penitent One, you stand before the tomb below which my name, Perpetua, rests, and with it, a body vanquished a long time ago. Although we were already introduced through the wounds of our confrontation, the audacity of your faith now gives us the chance to meet once again. A meeting behind the back of a miracle that ends up knowing all. You were able to defeat the lie created by the miraculous zeal that possessed my face and armor, but not my voice, which is now free of sin and dominion. Penitent One, I have seen a different path for you, whose ultimate destination is neither the forbidden nor the sacred places kept behind the high walls of Mother Church. Rise above all that, above even the halls of the dream.
Perpetua introduces an interesting concept that we hadn't seen before the Wounds of the Eventide DLC, that defiance of the omnipotent miracle is actually possible. She tells us that this meeting is taking place behind the back of the miracle, so straight away we know that this is the beginning of a conspiracy against the miracle, or more precisely, the High Wills. Indeed, she narrates the motivations which would lead Esdras to clash with us on the bridge, his concern for the damage we would do to his beloved church and religion. Indeed, this is true because, as we discussed, on the normal ending of Ending A, the Penitent One would eventually kill Escribar. But Perpetua wants us to rise above the schemes of the miracle, which would set us all against each other. She tells us something interesting about the miracle's abilities. She tells us that the version that fought us near Hondo was a lie, that it was not truly Perpetua acting of her own free will, only her form recreated by her zeal, her faith, and perhaps it was through this fake version that the miracle hoped to manipulate and control Esdras. It is certainly this false Perpetua that fights alongside Esdras in the original boss fight before the Wounds of the Eventide. It introduces the idea that the miracle is able to manipulate the faith of people to control them, that perhaps some of those who act on behalf of the miracle are not doing it out of true faith, rather they are having their faith manipulated and used as a chain. And this is an important point that will come back when we speak of Crisanta shortly. But with evidence in hand that we have spoken to the true Perpetua, we are able to turn Esdras to our cause. He then later speaks to the true Perpetua, and thus he becomes our ally. We then meet Esdras at a location where our first kneeling apparently took place, and this is the event referred to in the first kneeling comic where we were killed by Crisanta after retrieving the Mea Culpa sword. And it is here that Esdras reveals to us that he has been aware of a long kept secret, a secret kept in the depths of the church. Behind a long lost door is a chamber of heresy that lies beneath the very roots of the Tree of the Three Words. And in this chamber, we meet one of the most impactful NPCs in the entire franchise, the Traitor's Visage. This visage has a lot to say, a lot of truths to share with us, and the impact of its weighty dialogue becomes even more so when you realise who this visage is. This visage was a close adherent of the Father himself. To begin to understand who this visage is and how it's connected to the Father, we need to understand what the Golden Visages are. We of course encounter 3 others through the game, as guardians of the 3 humiliations, meeting one after the Ten Piedad, the Lady of the Charred Visage, and the Tres Angustias. After each of these boss fights, we kneel before some saintly remains, and we're transported to the Dream to speak to one of the Golden Visages, who bestow a wound on us. When you kneel before the first remains and speak to the first Golden Visage, it tells you that the body you just kneeled before are its mortal remains.
When you humbled yourself before my most holy body, you have been granted the presence of my Golden Visage, custodian of one of the 3 sorrows of the soul in penance.
This means that the Golden Visages are manifestations of these saints, and they live on in the Dream as these Golden Visages, granted this new form by the miracle. And they play a role in the pilgrimage of the Penitent One or anyone else who proves themselves worthy by performing the 3 humiliations. They bring out a wound, which the Golden Visage describes as one of the 3 sorrows of the soul in penance. As everything with the miracle, we have to perform a penance, and as the Penitent One, by performing these 3 humiliation and taking these 3 wounds, we have performed the proper penance that allows us entry into the Mother of Mothers Church. So in short, the Golden Visages are a new kind of angelic form bestowed upon worthy martyrs whose remains are still in the mortal realm. That being said, the Wounds of the Eventide DLC did expand upon the lore of these mysterious beings with the introduction of the Traitor Visage. This Traitor Visage is clearly another of the Golden Visages, but has been imprisoned for some reason. The fact this visage is the same type as these other 3 Golden Visages is reinforced by the fact that it seems to be the source of the final wound that we get in the Wounds of the Eventide DLC. After we freed Crisanta and we meet her at the Kneeling Church, she gives us the final wound. However, the item description for this wound implies that it was actually bestowed upon her by this Traitor Visage, meaning it also gives out wounds like the other visages. The item description reads as follows: "Mark that the exiled visage bestowed upon Crisanta, in an attempt to reveal the truth to her, and finally open her silver eyes. But the heavy chains forged by the high wells soon close them again." This 4th wound is the titular Wounds of the Eventide, and we will talk a little bit more about what that means in the latter part of this video. But for now, it's just interesting to note that this visage does give out the 4th wound of the soul, meaning it is the same as the other 3 visages. The item that this visage gives us is interesting as well. This is the true heart of the Mea Culpa, and it details the 4 closest adherents of the Father. The lore panel for this item reads the following: 4 was the number of the Father's greatest devotees, 4 who witnessed the first miracle, 4 who prayed before the young man who twisted and contorted as his joints took root in the towering tree. 4 who heard the 3 words uttered by the Father just before his last breath, 4 who admired how the knotted tree from which liquid gold flowed grew, 4 who were the witnesses to the first miracle, but only one of whom could see the miracle itself. He saw its form, fate, and origin, a divine trinity, the High Wills. There's a lot to unpack here, and we'll revisit this item description a number of times in the following chapters. However, the fact this comes directly from the traitor visage leads us to conclude that the one who could see the truth is this traitor, and the other 3 of the named 4 must be the 3 other golden visages, meaning the saints that we perform the 3 humiliations to are 3 of the closest adherents to the Father, and the 4th was also one. These were clearly important figures in the early miracle religion, and as such they were granted the golden visage status by the miracle, and they ascended to the dream. But the traitor visage tells us an interesting story of how it was imprisoned here by its fellow visages when it saw the truth and tried to tell them.
You stand before the roots of the knotted tree of the 3 words, for these form the bars of my captivity. They claim that my words are false, and that mine is the face of deception. And for this reason, I have been exiled from my 3 other brothers, the holy guardian visages. They betrayed me, punished me, and ripped out my eyes, so I could no longer be a witness to the truth.
When this pious individual was rewarded and ascended to the visage state, it clearly ascended to the dream like the other visages. But here it saw the truth. It saw the true face of the being that controlled the miracle, the High Wills. This would be troubling for a person of faith to learn that their god is actually being controlled behind the veil by a puppet master, by another eldritch form. In its dialogue, it also hits upon something we had already discussed when we were mentioning Perpetua, that the High Wills are able to manipulate those of faith and belief to, quote, lull their consciousness and chain them.
In the most fervent souls, in the most devout hearts, lives the seed that lulls the consciousness and controls the will. They are the links of invisible chains that hail from remote, sacred, and forbidden places, from where the High Wills dwell.
The reason this is likely an issue to this traitor visage and Perpetua is that it's a manipulation of faith. Faith, by definition, is doing something that you believe in out of choice. If this High Wills is manipulating those of the faithful to essentially brainwash them, to control them, and to take their choice away, then it's no longer true faith. It is a parody, a mockery of faith. And this is something that needs to end. There is nothing holy about it, there is nothing sacred about it. It's just an eldritch force manipulating people to its own ends. But it was only one visage who saw this truth, and when he started to narrate what he saw to his brother visages, they clearly saw this as slander, as blasphemy. So they banished him and took out his eyes so that this truth would never be seen again. Now, this visage is one of the forefront members of the rebellion, the first to see the truth and the first likely to speak it. However, I do believe that the Father, the Twisted One, is somehow overseeing or guiding this rebellion, guiding the steps of the Penitent One. Why do I believe that the Father is the hidden hand behind this rebellion? Well, aside from the fact that we know this visage was likely one of the Father's most loyal adherents, there is a fascinating scene that plays out after we kill the High Wills at the end of the Wounds of the Eventide DLC. When the brutal act is done, a single figure appears before the Penitent One. It is the Twisted One. The Father then pats the Penitent One's shoulder in a gesture of gratitude before disappearing. For me, this is the Father's way of thanking the Penitent One before he fades, finally freed from his eternal torment at the hands of the miracle. Of course, the Visage is still one of the key players in this rebellion, given he was the first to see the truth, And perhaps it is just this visage that's the main orchestrator of the rebellion, acting from its own accord and judgment with no guidance from the Father. However, I feel there's a sort of invisible hand guiding this rebellion, a force that has orchestrated Perpetua, the visage, and then later Crisanta to act in concert. After all, Perpetua also seems to have remarkable insight into the truth, and seems to be able to guide the Penitent One. Where did she get this information from? Who had the foresight to enlist Perpetua, or give Perpetua these visions, so that Esdras would lead the Penitent One to the traitor? For me, another piece of evidence is the traitor's location. It is imprisoned in the roots of the Tree of the Three Words, the tree that grew from the corpse of the Father. The miracle enjoys ironic or fitting punishment, and to me it would make sense that the Father's closest follower would be left to suffer in the roots from the tree of his own making. Perhaps seeing such suffering of his own follower and friend has made the Father sympathise and begin this rebellion. There is also the idea of thematic harmony, and by this I mean the Father fits in this particular story because of the Penitent One's association with him. And again, I just can't shake the image of the Father appearing before the Penitent One after he's slaughtered the High Wills and thanking him, as far as I can tell, as well as the fact the Father seems to appear at the ending of Blasphemous 2, a fact we'll get into shortly. Again, the good ending of Blasphemous 2 is where the Penitent One is guided to defy the miracle. Each case, there seems to be an association to the Father, making me think he is the source and guiding hand of these rebellions against the miracle. Interestingly, there are hints that the miracle may feel threatened by the Father and his influence. The Star of Dawn DLC introduces the character Laudes and her 4 Amanecidas. Laudes was a devotee of the Father who was so devoted to him that her love manifested as gold copies of herself, her 4 Amanecidas. The miracle was so peeved at her devotion to the Father over it that it imprisoned her for a millennia, only releasing her when it struck a deal with her, to kill the Penitent One in exchange for her freedom. Does this lend credence to the idea that the miracle potentially saw the Father as a rival? After all, besides the miracle, the Father is the only being that is close to being revered as a deity in its own right, with Laudes and the 4 apostles who would become the Golden Visages and Silent Brotherhood all being loyal to the Father in particular. It is clear the Twisted One is a being of great influence even in his own right, detached from the miracle religion. Now that is a lot of speculation, but I think it's a premise which best fits, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on who you think the Golden Visage would be. Either way, if you don't believe the Father is involved, it's clear that there are those who want to shake off the shackles of the High Wills because of the mockery that they make of true faith. It is easy to see why one would be resentful of this parasitic force who has used your own faith against you to make you a puppet. To reiterate, Crisanta seems to be puppeted against her own will, and according to the dialogue of the traitor Visage, it's because she is of the strongest faith that High Wills have manipulated this into literally chaining her, and it's only with the true heart of the mea culpa that we're able to literally destroy these chains and free Crisanta's mind. This person of great faith, of loyalty to the church, is then freed from the mask that had been covering her eyes, from the chains that were chained to her faith. Feeling the full force of the wound of the Eventide and having the truth of her manipulation revealed to her means she changes side. She joins with the Penitent One. She knows that he is the only one who can end this cycle of suffering. She passes on this 4th wound, the wound of the Eventide. The lore tab for this wound reads the following: Holy Creed, Forbidden Verse. It is only the 4th wound that, unlike its sisters, makes the soul suffer in a way that goes beyond repentance as an act and beyond guilt as a perpetual state. It is only the 4th that represents the deepest and most forbidden pain, the greatest and truest wound of the lost soul, the wounds of the Eventide. This is called the wound of abnegation, and abnegation is essentially the act of renouncing or rejecting something. And this is clearly a rejection of the High Wills as the ultimate and supreme authority. Not quite a rejection of your faith, but a rejection of the status quo of them as the top hierarchical power. And given they are essentially the supreme power of this world, it causes a wound in the soul, For the faithful to reject the ultimate supreme power in their religion would no doubt cause a wound to the soul. At least that is my interpretation of it. It does also make sense with Eventide. Eventide is essentially the end of the day, so the wound of the Eventide is the end of this faith, as it is now in the age of Blasphemous One. It's the understanding that despite your faith and belief in a system, it's time to reject and end it. Given that guilt, penance, and wounding the soul seems to be key in advancing in this world, it makes sense that this final wound, this fourth wound, is the key step that allows you to ascend to the eternal procession, the realm of the High Wills themselves. After the defeat of Escribar and ascending the Pile of Ash, we ascend, literally, to the higher realm known as the Endless Procession. This is the Miracle's holy realm, and we are greeted by none other than Escribar again, who has been rewarded in death with a new form and renewed purpose, the guardian of this sacred place. We are not meant to be here, yet thanks to Crisanta's final bit of guidance and bestowment of the fourth holy wound, we are able to trespass in this realm. We are trespassing in a realm meant only for the faithful dead, with grim purpose to bring death to the Supreme Trinity, who are pulling the chains of the world below. We have already discussed the reasons why we have been brought here. There are those that believe that the High Will's control over the world below is an abomination, and not only are the High Wills manipulating the faithful and controlling them, they also seem to be in control of the Miracle itself, as Crisanta describes them as the supreme force that controls even the Miracle.
Penitent One, there is something greater than the Mother Church, greater than the Miracle, greater than what I have protected with my life and my faith. It is that which controls the Miracle. I am speaking of the Supreme Trinity, the High Wills.
We also speak to the High Wills themselves, and they somewhat describe their relationship to the Miracle through a rather convoluted dialogue. Convoluted, but has some very interesting details that we need to pay attention to. They say,
"We are the High Wills.
For there is no miracle that does not stem from our desire.
That is not our reflection.
That is not our word.
The word that was first made flesh and then sanctified.
Penitent One, does not the pale, still light of this vast horizon hurt your eyes?
Of this procession, more ancient than us, that extends out before you without end nor beginning.
Of this brotherhood of grieving souls, held captive by their own condemnation and benediction.
This is the path of the ancient processions, the kingdom that the Miracle wove from threads of dreams.
A domain where faith would unite in one single, uninterrupted act of adoration.
Now, up until this point, with other bits of lore, you could be mistaken for believing that the High Wills are the creator of the Miracle, and that's where the lore seems to have been pointing. For example, we have the lore of the first Miracle, where the Father prayed to the High Wills for pain, and this is in a time before the Miracle had manifested itself, because of course it first manifests through him. Therefore, if he is praying to the High Wills prior to anyone knowing about the existence of the Miracle, it would suggest that the High Wills are the creator or progenitor of the Miracle. And this is something that I concluded in a time before the Wounds of the Eventide DLC came out, in an old speculation lore video, which I will link below if you're interested on my perspective prior to the DLC coming out. But in essence, I looked at the base game and the few references that we had to the High Wills and concluded that they were a higher power that had created the Miracle. This also seems to be backed up by another item description we have already looked at. The true heart of the Mea Culpa, which I remind you reads the following. but only one of whom could see the miracle itself. He saw its form, fate, and origin, a divine trinity, the High Wills. So even when playing this DLC before I met the High Wills, I was under the impression that we were likely going to find out that the High Wills were indeed the supreme creator of the miracle. However, the lines from the very High Wills themselves seem to have some contradictory evidence to this, for they say that the miracle created the endless processions, the realm that they now inhabit, in a time long before they even existed. But before that, they claim that they are the High Wills because there is no miracle that does not stem from our desire. That is not their word. There are a lot of different ways that we can interpret the words that are said here by the High Wills, but the most simple, taking their words at face value, is that the miracle created the eternal processions before the High Wills even existed, but now the High Wills seem to control the miracle, even if they didn't create it, and in fact the miracle is older than them. So therefore the most obvious conclusion to this is that the High Wills are in fact a creation of the miracle. They have gold streaming from their eyes, and as we know from the Knot of the Three Words and many other of the saints and creations of the miracle, gold is very much heavily entwined with acts of the miracle. I would therefore suggest that this is just another manifestation of the miracle. As we said at the beginning of this video, the start of the first game makes it clear that the miracle manifests what's inside us anyway, whether that be punishment, blessing, or guilt. And therefore, if we are to believe that the High Wills are the works of the miracle as well, they must be a manifestation of something as well. And it must be faith, in my opinion. After all, they say that the miracle created this domain, the endless processions, where faith would unite in a single, uninterrupted act of adoration. I think this is that union. This is the manifestation of the faith of people, the religious belief that people have in a higher power. It was manifested by the power of the miracle, but as we'll see when we look at Blasphemous 2 at the last chapter and in another video, the miracle does need guidance. This is why it ultimately tries to create the miracle child in Blasphemous 2. It needs a locus, an icon, or something to control and focus its powers. When it acts by itself, it seems to act like a bit of a child, and this is something that the witness himself says.
Lacking sufficient mastery, the miracle did fail in its efforts to incarnate, manifesting only in the form of disease, deformity, and pain. It spread more and more of its aberrations, like sores on diseased skin, in many places and on innocent bodies.
It can't necessarily control its powers or desires without some external help, and therefore the High Wills, the manifestation of belief itself, of faith itself, would help guide the miracle in bestowing miracles on the land of Custodia. That's my most basic takeaway of what the High Wills are. There's of course the possibility that I am wrong, and the intention is that High Wills are meant to still be the creator gods of the miracle itself, and the idea that the endless processions are more ancient than them is just some kind of timey-wimey stuff, some time loop stuff, some time-breaking stuff that happens because of the eldritch nature of the miracle and the High Wills. However, I do believe that the High Wills are a creation of the miracle. We have to take their word for it. I think their word is more important than anything else, and the fact they are having those tears of gold coming down their face is a big one for me. But if that is true, how do we square this with the wording of the true heart of the Mea Culpa that says that they are the origin of the miracle? Well, I would say that this is just a little bit of difficult wording. After all, this heart is actually referring to the first miracle of the Father, his twisting, and thus I think they are still the origin of that first miracle, that they somehow directed the miracle to manifest in this way. That's just my interpretation, and ultimately maybe this is all meant to be contradictory on purpose and we aren't meant to fully understand the true nature of these High Wills. But at the end of the day, I do believe they are a manifestation of people's faith. The endless processions are a place where the faithful go to after they die, and it would make sense that these High Wills are the final manifestation of everyone's faith in the miracle. However, what is clear, no matter what you believe, whether they are the creators of the miracle or vice versa, is that the miracle does heavily depend upon them. For their final speech makes it clear that if we kill them, if we kill this manipulating force, the miracle will be left without direction, and this is the ultimate heresy.
You have come to this place to atone for your sins, to put an end to this work.
Destroying our flesh that once was word, and now is but silence.
Making us cast down our eyes, leaving the miracle bereft.
I think this is very much reflected by the idea that the miracle seems to retreat from the world following the end of Blasphemous One. We see that shortly after we kill the High Wells, all of the miracles of the miracle seem to be undone, a sure sign that it is retreating from this world. The mea culpa fades, again a sword born from its power. The Father appears before the Penitent One before he too fades. And finally, the Penitent One himself collapses and dies. Remember we discussed this earlier, that the Penitent One's immortality is the result of the miracle. And as such, if the miracle retreats, then the Penitent One himself will die. And then of course we have a large time gap where the miracle seems entirely absent between Blasphemous 1 and Blasphemous 2. So Crisanta and the Penitent One strike down the High Wells, and this death is very clearly keenly felt by the miracle. Retreating from Custodia and essentially being forgotten by the people of Custodia for a long time, it only returns when a pious couple that remember the miracle pray to it sincerely, and moved by their sincere prayer, the miracle returns to the world, creates the witness, and its abominations seem to spread again. The creation of the miracle child has a little bit more to it, involving a young child's prayer, but we will look at that probably in the next video. But overall, we have to understand that the miracle has been absent from the world because of the loss of the High Wells. As they predicted, it was left bereft without their guidance. In many ways, I therefore see the creation of the miracle child by the miracle as something to replace the High Wells. It needs a focus in the real world, and this is something the witness itself says to us.
The miracle was to create a new icon, an incarnate icon for all to revere. A symbol in which all our faiths, pleas, and hopes might be united in communion, so as to expand its diminished, almost extinct might.
The miracle child formed with the Penitent One acts as the perfected icon, taking the place of the High Wells for its second reign. My only question left would be regarding the good ending of Blasphemous 2, the Canvas of Light and Time, where it seems that the Penitent One is honoured by other saints, but free of the miracle, in a sort of heavenly state. Here, Penitent One is surrounded by a lot of the saints, or essentially victims of the miracle, including characters from both games. However, once again, the most prominent character on this canvas is the Father. The bad ending is clearly the one that the miracle intended, for us to combine with the miracle child to make its new icon. However, it's clear the good ending is something it didn't intend, because this is what the wording of the ending indeed says, that we have defeated the plans of the miracle.
The affliction cometh to an end, for the icon falls, and with it, the miracle's designs, and its will so capricious.
So ultimately, how did this happen? How did we beat the miracle at its own game? What guided us to do so? It becomes clear that there are other forces at work in the world, not just the miracle. The item we get at the end of the good quest to get the good ending is the incense of the envoys, which is the charred remains of the 4 envoys that we need to unlock a door within the Church of the Five Doves. This item description is very interesting because it mentions a great grace, something that is capitalized, meaning it is a something. These 4 envoys themselves are interesting as well, and I want to take a moment to talk about them. These are 4 golden sculptures that we must place in our altarpiece in order to access a secret door, where we can burn these envoys and get the incense. The envoy lore tabs don't give us much about who these individuals might be, Rather, it does give us an interesting account of the miracle child's birth. However, what is interesting is that in the Canvas of Light and Time ending, we see these envoys for real. They are the 4 gilded characters who carry us up to the canvas. With Annunciada at our side, it poses a question. What is this faction that's been guiding us towards this ending? Annunciada has been subtly guiding us from the beginning, and her presence here implies this was the conclusion she anticipated from the beginning when she guided us towards killing the 3 sentinels. Likewise, who do these 4 envoys serve? Who do these 4 envoys work for? What is the Great Grace? And why do these seem to be guiding us to commit this great penitence so that the miracle's work is undone? Again, I think these are questions for another time, and maybe like Blasphemous One, we'll get more information on this Great Grace and the forces that oppose the miracle in a DLC. But again, what I find interesting is that the Father's figure is one of the largest people within this Canvas of Light and Time. My speculation? If the Father himself is not the Great Grace, an opposing deity to the miracle, I believe he is certainly someone who has guided the Penitent One through his entire journey, to undo this endless cycle. Despite the fact he is the first saint of the miracle religion, the Penitent one of his most loyal adherents of a sect that worshipped him, seems to be the main player in undoing the works of the miracle. How can we not presume that the Father, the very being that he worships, has guided him along these steps? It's just my speculation, and again I believe we will learn more in a future DLC about this Great Grace and the forces that seem to oppose the miracle. But I believe that the Father is one of the major players in this rebellion. He guided our hands in the wounds of the Eventide, and now he guides the Penitent One to this final victory over the grievous miracle. And as such, he gets to reward his most faithful follower by giving him a position in this Canvas of Light and Time. So thanks guys, that is my take on the wounds of the Eventide, the High Wills, and the ending of Blasphemous 2. If you like this video, please give me a like. I know there's a lot of speculation in this video, and the fact that Blasphemous Lore is constructed in that way definitely necessitates a lot of speculation. So I'd like to hear your thoughts and theories in the comments below. I think next time I'll touch upon the Miracle Child and the greater story of Blasphemous 2 and why the miracle behaves in the way it does in the second game. But until next time guys, I will see you in the lands of Custodia. Take care and have a wonderful night.